Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Azure podcast. I'm your host, Sam Foote, and I'm here with my good friend Alan Armstrong. How are you, Al?
Hey, I'm not too bad. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you. What have you been up to over the past? Are we actually on time this week? Well, this episode has it actually been 2 weeks since the last one?
Yeah, I think it has actually. I think we're on schedule this week
Well, I just
or
want to.
this
I'm
time.
just gonna. I don't know if you can hear that on the microphone. That's me clapping for us to make sure that we're on schedule and we haven't gone. Oh, we'll do that next week. So no, but what have you been up to over the past couple of weeks?
Uh, just working and chilling at the weekends, really.
Yeah,
Yeah. What about you?
exactly the same, really. It's that's COVID life for you, isn't it? Not much else has really happened. Let me think. There must have been something exciting that happened to me. No, I don't think there is. I think it's just been work. So yeah. So today, everyone, we're going to talk about on-premise versus the cloud, and we're gonna take you through a little. Well, it's not going to really be a history lesson, is it? I suppose we're not historians. Um, but we're gonna talk about why companies have moved from on-premise infrastructure into the cloud. Um, are there cost advantages? Do we get more reliability? What are the pros and cons of both sides of it? Because it's not just a straight the cloud is better than on-premise, right? It's a balancing act between benefits and drawbacks on both sides. So yeah, so that's what we're going to do, and we're going to talk about why we as IT professionals should care about the differences between on-premise and the cloud, because that is ultimately this podcast is all about Azure. So we are very cloud focused, but I think it's always good to see what the other options are out there, not just from cloud providers. I think we should do an episode on other cloud providers as well, but we should also talk about the different structures of IT infrastructure, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's go back in time then. So, Alan, can you just give me an overview of what do we mean when we say on premise?
So what we mean by on-premise is, in essence, where kind of the hardware and the server compute was located. So we're talking about data centers, in the building, loads of server racks, loads of networking, and even in smaller businesses, servers under desks and servers in the same office and things like that.
Okay, so what we're talking about is if we've got a server, which is just if we take it down to its basic concept, just a computer, right? It's a specialized computer that just does one or a few tasks, right? And before we had them inside of our offices, right? We had IT professionals that looked after that inside of our business. And they were physically located inside of our offices, and we also did all of the maintenance, and we managed those servers, didn't we? And it's not just servers, I suppose. It's also networking as well, right? Like you say, the local network, the point-to-point connections between offices and the various other components of IT infrastructure.
Yeah, and things like firewalls and
Yeah.
security products in there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose we've also just got to mention as well is traditionally software was procured and run internally inside of an organization, right? Before this, large movement towards, subscription-based, software services like SaaS software. That's what I'm talking about. Sorry, go on now.
I was going to say, which stands for software as a service.
Software as a
For anyone that
service. Yeah.
doesn't know, yeah.
Yeah. So when somebody says that's a SaaS piece of software, it's software as a service. So instead of buying and installing, or buying a license to installing that software locally on your IT infrastructure, you just pay a certain license fee, maybe per user or by consumption, to access that remotely, and you don't worry about any of those infrastructure costs or those IT costs, right? So I suppose, can you just take us through, Al, like what are some of the biggest drawbacks with having, if we talk about the cloud, and I think a lot of people listening to this will understand what the cloud is, And in essence, it's just a bunch of servers in Microsoft's data centers instead of them being inside of your office. So, what are the drawbacks of having on-premise servers versus allowing Azure to handle that for you?
So it's kind of where the responsibility sits. So I mean, if you talk about today's world, on premise and cloud, and you talk about compute, virtualization, you know, in an on premise environment, you've got to look after the servers, make sure they're up, make sure the power, all the supply to them, aircon and everything else is keeping them cool. Let alone patching of the hypervisor, the bit that's looking after the virtual machines. Within the cloud, that bit is managed by the host of that cloud service. So, Microsoft being Azure, so the fabric that looks after it, within AWS and G Suite and other sort of data center or private cloud providers, you don't look after that bit.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've got, I suppose we've got two parts really. We've got the physical infrastructure, so we're talking about, you know, power, cooling, fire suppression, the floor space to actually store those servers, the procurement of the servers themselves, right? Because they're capital expenditure. Servers are very expensive. So we've got all of that, and then the networking, like you say, like switches, routing. But then we've also got configuration and hardening. We need to make sure that our servers are secure, they're patched, the applications that run on them, or the virtual machines, or the applications are also patched and they are available 24/7, right? So we've got all of those risks well, not risks, yeah, I suppose it is risk to
And
the IT,
and you've
team.
also got physical access or security as well to that
Yeah,
data center
yeah,
or
that's true. Yeah,
stuff like that.
yeah, so making sure that only the correct people are allowed inside of that room and have physical access to those machines. Okay, so there's a number of sort of risks and problems that we could have. But what are some of the positives? I mean, there must be a reason that we still do have at least some, or some. I'm assuming there are lots of companies, companies out there that haven't switched to the cloud. What are some of the positives that you can think of to keep, infrastructure on premise?
I mean, I don't know if it's really a positive, but it's more of a reason for having on premise still for some companies, and that's probably due to compliance and legislation of the data. There are some things that may not be allowed to go into the cloud, or access to third party networks, which requires that data that you're using from them to be stored within physical buildings and things like that that you own, rather than being a cloud, a public cloud provider.
Yeah. So wherever you need more control, I suppose, when you, like you say, where you've potentially got a regulatory or a compliance issue there, where you need that control, that can be having that data on premise can alleviate a lot of those problems about the governance of the data that's stored on those systems.
Yeah, I mean, the the public clouds out there, the main three, they have quite a few regulatory certifications, ISO 27001, etc. So they are compliant. It's just there may be some requirement in a contract to say that their a partner's data is stored not in a cloud service or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and I can also imagine if you're working with a software vendor that hasn't got a cloud solution, you may still need to run some appliances locally, right? If you've got a bespoke piece of, say, ERP or manufacturing, like a manufacturing system that runs, on premise, that runs your machinery in your factory potentially. There's a lot of really bespoke, and sometimes quite archaic um, IT out there that runs some of that machinery. If that hasn't been up, you might capex a machine that might cost you like 2-3 million pounds, and it might have a 10 to 15 year life cycle on it before you're looking at replacing it, right? And if you think about a machine that was put in 15 years ago and it's controlled by some sort of on-premise IT appliance, what that still looks like now, that might be completely, what do they call it? Like when it's off the network, it could be completely isolated from the outside world, and it might still be running a really old version of the operating system for compatibility.
Yeah, I mean that is a good point. That there may be some old applications that companies are still using that they still have to use 'cause there's nothing else out there they can replace yet.
Yeah,
That is too old to move to the cloud, or it needs to be stored on premise because of the security, because it's unpatched now.
yeah, exactly.
It's
Yeah.
outdated. Not everyone can patch everything because of the app might break and things like that.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
that's one of those really, you can read as many white papers about how you should structure things, right? But there are just some gotchas out there in the world of IT that you cannot overcome, right? Like you can't, it's okay. It's like, okay, we'll move AD, to Azure AD, right? And we can do our MDM in the cloud and all of that sort of stuff. But when it comes to saying, oh yeah, this machine runs off of a server that's using server 2003, let's say, yeah, and the manufacturer is not supporting anything but server 2003, even though that's completely wrong in terms of security and patching and governance. But what you're going to do? Go out and buy a new, some of these machines cost millions, hundreds of thousands, or millions of pounds. Um, Trying to get that through just because of IT is it's potential that it's not going to happen, right?
yeah, absolutely. And I've sort of seen those situations as well,
Yeah.
where hardware has been, or the software on the hardware is really outdated. Windows 98 kind of thing, and trying to access network resources when it can't anymore because of SMB1 being disabled.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. I've heard you definitely talk about that before. So yeah,
uh,
in that scenario, there's no way that sort of equipment is going to get into the cloud, right?
yeah, and actually thinking about you talking about manufacturing, would you want the mechanisms that controls that automation, if it is automation, um, running, adding more reliance to something like the internet to be able to, for that process to run?
Yeah, yeah,
Does it need to be in the cloud? There's that kind of question as well.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
And like and when we're talking about like farming and agriculture, and maybe manufacturing outside of larger towns and cities. Maybe they don't have the internet connections to have an always-on connection to the cloud. So there's all of that to take into account.
yeah,
So yeah, so we've talked about on premise. It's I think it's obviously opinion time here, but I think it's kind of had its day, right? It's how we did things, and we're now moving to this more cloud and hosted infrastructure. So Al, take us through like what the cloud actually is. Just give me a really high level, I've never heard of the cloud before explanation.
it's an infrastructure or service that allows you to deploy various types of um, infrastructure or compute without having to worry about the like we kind of said earlier, the base of the looking after the servers and things like that. And there's various levels of what you can do. So there's infrastructure as a service, so that is virtual machines and physical virtual networking and things like that. And then you've got platform as a service, which is PaaS, and that's going to the next level. So not worrying about the servers, but just worrying about the application itself.
Yeah. So essentially what they've done is they've virtualized the physical machines that used to be under our desks and in our data centers, and they give you access to those on a per hour, per minute, or a yearly cost if you want to pay upfront fee, right? There's no capital expenditure. Well, you can pay up front. You could say, I want this instance. I know I'm going to want this instance for 3 years, and they'll give you a hefty discount for saying that. But essentially, in 2 minutes, I could open my Azure portal and I could say, I would like a server running Windows Server, whatever version, and I want it to have this specification. So I don't have to go and procure a server. I just tell Azure what I want, and Azure will automatically go and get me that instance and provision it for me. But that's infrastructure, right? So that's
Yeah.
still, I manage that instance, but I don't have to worry about any of the physical characteristics of that machine. I still need to make sure it's backed up, it's compliant, it's patched. But then you can take that step further. Like you just said, there's all these managed services on top of Azure. Um, if I want to do, if I want an MDM, I can buy an MDM, as a software as a service, really, or if I want to give my code, I've got an application that I want to run, I could give my code to Microsoft and they'll host that for me. And that's platform as a service.
Yeah. So the example is, I guess the example is that you could have as IaaS, infrastructure as a service, you could build a virtual machine and install SQL Server. Or you could buy it as a platform as a service. So you just get the SQL Server. So you don't have to worry about patching the server. It automatically gets patched
Okay,
for
so
you. You
yeah. Okay, so essentially what we're doing is we are the main like benefits of the cloud is that we can um, pass some of that operational and capitalized costs onto and risks onto those cloud providers, right? Because it's Microsoft's responsibility to make sure, in the case of Azure anyway, to make sure that instance is available to me whenever I want to access it. If I've said that I want a 24/7 on server, they're going to make sure they're going to be the ones that are there actually fixing those machines if they were to potentially go down um, on a Friday night when we're all trying to chill out for the weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that they've got SLAs of something like 99.5% for all their infrastructure. And again, with sort of the cloud side of things, you can choose your region, so you can actually host services in other continents, countries where
Yep.
there is a there is a data center.
Yep.
So it's fairly easy to sort of move an app, have an application in multiple locations and
Yep.
things like that.
So, what would you say are some of the drawbacks of the cloud, versus on premise? Are there
Uh,
any? Do you think?
I I think it's more around some of it's around. I mean, we're going to talk about it in a minute, but around the costings that um, cloud compute and things like that seems more expensive or can look to be more expensive. But I think we'll talk about it in a bit. But
Yeah.
there's that, and I guess it's just well, to be honest, I'm not too sure what other sort of drawbacks there are to it.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose for me, I suppose it's obviously the inverse of what we're talking about with on-premise, right? You do lose a level of control. If your virtual machine goes down at midnight, how do you get support? How much do you have to pay for support? And you are reliant on a third party to make sure your infrastructure is up. So a company might just say, well, we don't want to, so what happens if Microsoft don't fulfill its SLAs? I mean, that's not, we don't think that that's. I don't sit there thinking that Microsoft's out to deceive us. Obviously, I don't think, but I could imagine that some people are quite, could be quite worried about making sure that because let's say you have quite a small company, yeah, and you've got one server in Azure. You're not going to pay for premium support, or you might not be able to afford to pay for premium support where you get a 24/7 helpline to a dedicated account management team, right? Um, so you might be waiting. If you put a ticket in, you might be waiting. Out of hours, especially. A few hours to get a call back. And that could be. Some businesses. They're not 9 to 5 Monday to Friday. I've got some businesses that I work with, and their busiest day of the week is Sunday because they're scheduling all of their people for the next week. So
Yeah.
that to get the level of out of hours support that they would need could potentially be a lot of money. And I can imagine having the conversation. I mean, that client of mine is in the cloud already, right? All their stuff is hosted. They don't have anything in their, in their office. But I could imagine that if we ever had a large outage and the solution that I put in front of them wasn't robust enough, then they would be going, well, I'm just going to buy a server and stick it in the corner of the office because yes, it could go down, but we would be in control of it, right? We could all pile into the office on a Sunday and get it fixed. Not that I would ever want to do that, obviously. And I'm quite fortunate with that client is they understand that things need to be robust. There needs to be a disaster recovery plan. What's the business continuity plan if those things go down, and they've made provision to make sure that can happen. But that does come at a cost. It basically doubles your cloud spend. So, when you look at an advert and they say, yes, you can get instances from $30 a month, that is not production ready, so, and I think it can be a bit misleading when you see a provider saying, we start from, I think Microsoft's messaging is pretty good, and this might be a little bit of a rant of other providers, but it's like starts from $5 a month, and it's like, that is not the reason to go to the cloud, that it costs $5 a month for a virtual machine.
And just to say about, 'cause, I mean, you talked about resilience and things like that, that talking from a Microsoft perspective, that they have the availability sets. So every region kind of has like a paired region. So for the UK, you've got UK South and UK West.
Yeah.
For Europe, you've got the North Europe and West Europe. So if you've put stuff in West Europe and you've got an availability set, and for some reason West Europe goes down, it will be pushed over to North Europe to continue to run.
Yeah.
So there may be still an outage of the server going down, but the config gets moved over. I mean, if you talk about, I mean, you're going to be talking about it later about some of the updates, but the replication at the data centers, Microsoft has it in one data centers on 3 sets of different disks across the
Correct.
data
Yes.
center
Yeah.
for the data, and then if you have regional replication, then it's on 3 sets in another data center.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah. And you can, I suppose one thing is, if we talk about natural disaster, there is no real way to get around that if you have a single office location and you have all your IT on premise, right? If there's a fire, or if there's some sort of power or internet outage at that location, that can wreak absolute havoc, can't it? So, and you can't get around that with just having one location. So I suppose that's another massive benefit of the cloud, is it can be replicated into multiple data centers to get that level of resilience. So
yes,
yes, go on.
especially if you're only in, your location is only in one country, for example, even if you're multi-site.
Yeah,
you know I know that there's some business continuity plans that you can have, that or disaster recovery, that you've got to have your next disaster recovery X miles away in case of an event. But
yeah,
trying to make it into another country is, without paying the earth for another site, another internet connection, blah, everything else.
yeah. So let's just focus just for a few minutes. It'll probably be more than a few minutes, knowing us, but let's go for a few minutes to start off with. About I suppose my big question coming into this conversation is, Al, do you actually think the cloud is cheaper? That's a very loaded
I
question.
think, yeah, I think on the face of it, when you compare it to on premise, it doesn't seem like it's cheaper.
Yeah,
But actually, when you start diving into what resource and what everything's costing you to run the data center, or the on-premise infrastructure and stuff, it kind of is either equivalent or it's partially cheaper. Um, I think a lot of people, or I say a lot of people, I see a lot of people say, on premise is cheaper. I don't pay for a server when I want to spin it up. You kind of think, well, you had to pay, for that infrastructure first at some point.
Yeah.
Okay, you bought it and it's going to last 3 years, but that was a cost, and that was a upfront cost. Let alone the cost of aircon, all the stuff we said, the
Yeah.
fire suppression system, all the power it's using, the people to manage it. It's not just depending on the size of the company. The one I worked for, had sort of 3 people looking after the data center, plus like 2 or 3 networking teams
Yeah.
to look after the data center network.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think that cloud, I think because cloud pricing is so simplistic, right? Because it's, you could say, and that, I think that's that is a valid argument to say, when I want to bring another application online, I have to bring up another server or instance or whatever it is you're bringing up, right? And your cost, you know you just bear that cost, right? Whereas before you could say, oh well, we've over provisioned this server, and now we can, so it's, I've got this, spare bit of this server over here that we over provisioned, and now we can put this application on there because we've got enough space on there, right? Because we had the foresight to think that we were going to have new applications coming online. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that you can attack and say, well, that application is going to cost me £500 a month, let's say, in Azure, right? Which would be a lot of money to spend on, with redundancy, all of the processing power it needs, storage costs and backup and all of those things, right? But it's not comparing the cost of a server, it's also comparing the cost of somebody's time to maintain that server, and all of the hidden costs of having a server in a rack. Like we've said, fire suppression, that needs to be serviced every 6 or 12 months or whatever, and tested. Air conditioning, all of these things have capital expenditure costs. Like air conditionings for a data center is not cheap. You're trying to cool a huge amount of energy that's being pumped into that room. There's the floor space. The floor space, I don't know if anybody's listening has ever rented an office and looked at how much it costs per square foot once you add business rates, rent, heat. And we live in a northern, the northern hemisphere, so, and quite, well, not quite far up. It's not that cold in the UK, but we don't have the best weather, do we? And our, the heating costs in the winter, and making sure, and in the summer, it's double as bad because we're trying to reduce the heat in those rooms. So I think it's really easy for somebody in IT to look at the cost of the server over its lifetime, but forget about all of those other infrastructure costs. Like you were just saying, you had, let's say, 3 data center people plus 2 network people. If you think about, senior IT engineers, senior IT professionals, you're talking, for a team of 5, you could be talking 500, 600, 700,000 pounds a year. When you take into account their pension, holiday, and all of
yeah,
those things, right? You know.
and um, kind of the thing I was saying about if you compared it for like virtualization, so hosting VMs on a pool of servers, things like that.
Yeah.
You build that I guess that resource that so you can have X amount of machines on it. But when you first buy it, what you have 10 on it, assuming that you're gonna have 100, and
Yeah.
you'll not. It's kind of wasting that compute.
You are, yeah, yeah. You're front loading your cost, and you're predicting what your usage could be. Imagine if you provision it. You say, I've got 10 applications at the moment, but I'm going to spec my server so that I could run 100. And imagine if you never change from 10,
Well, what
and
it's
how
the
much
other way
money you would
around.
waste, right?
It's the other way around as well. Say you spec it for 100 and you had 100, and then you decide you don't need these applications. You start
Yeah,
cutting it down.
yeah,
Then
exactly.
per server cost that month, that year becomes increased.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I guess that's one of the benefits of the cloud is that you can spin up, spin down, and you only pay for what you use.
Yeah. Yeah, and we see a lot of cost saving measures in the cloud, right? If you've got applications that are only used in Um, in 9 to 5 office hours, you can shut them down and save yourself some cost. If you really want to set that up so that they get shut down and they get archived until they're brought back up on a Friday and then brought back on a Monday. There's loads of ways to reduce your cost, right? And that's just forgetting the fact that you can now have these platforms as a service. You could move some of your automation to logic apps or function apps, which are like cost pennies to execute. So which is even cheaper for the enterprise. So I suppose my next question to you, Al, is do you have to be all or the other? Is there a way to be hybrid? Can you have on premise and the cloud?
I think what's happening is everyone, well, majority of customers or organizations out there are hybrid, because you've got, people have, like you said, I think before, people have bought infrastructure, they're using it till it's end of life or deemed sweating the assets per se.
Yeah,
um, and again, you might have that situation where you might have to have some, that small amount of on-prem, but still have the cloud. And there is, I mean, for Microsoft, you've got Express Routes, you've got the VPNs that you can connect, so that it's as if it is like another site, another data center that's connected to you. From a user perspective, that it on premise, it's as if it's next to them. They're
yeah,
not going to know any different, apart from maybe a small amount of latency as it goes over the internet pipe,
yeah.
etc.
So how would you determine that at an organization? Is it a case of going in and consulting and working out what can be moved, what makes sense to be moved to the cloud, and what should stay on-prem?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from a hybrid perspective, it is, what can you do that's different to, if you've got an application that is, just web application with a SQL database, can you move it to PaaS, platform as a service, to reduce that cost? So you have to manage the code and the actual website and things like that. You don't have to worry about the patching and everything. Reduce
Yeah,
costs that way. Um, like you said, is there services that don't need to run 24/7?
yeah,
Um, a lot of it is probably starting off with, I've got a new service. Do I put it in my do I put it on premise, or do I put it into the cloud and start that slow migration? Anything new, I look at PaaS, SaaS, software as a service, and IaaS kind of thing, where it makes sense. So there is definitely a bit of, um, I guess,
yeah.
understanding. I'm thinking of the word now. It's like analysis of the applications and what you've got there.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, because that's really where you're going to get your best, not just bang for buck, but also the best resilience and best IT infrastructure. Right, is where you can, as an organization, work out what the best tool for the job is for any given scenario. So you might say that it makes sense to get Exchange, you know, out off to the cloud, right? Because hosted Exchange in Azure makes an absolutely ton of sense, doesn't it?
Right, just from the storage perspective.
Right. So in that scenario, you might say, okay, well, what we're going to do, is we're going to connect our Active Directory up to Azure AD, and we're going to migrate Exchange, and then once we're in Office 365, then we can do things like Teams, and we get that sort of connectivity. But and exactly like what you're saying is, once our infrastructure becomes end of life, or our internal application servers that may be managed by third parties, right? You might have bought a black box solution from somebody. Once those come to end of life, then we'll look at on-prem versus cloud replacements for those services. But that could take 5, 6, 7, 8 years for those appliances to become up for renewal.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like I said, I think it is like a journey to the cloud still. I don't think it is one or the other. I think, if you're a new business starting up, I kind of think it's worth just jumping to the cloud, because you ain't got to worry about buying the space for the rack, or
Yeah.
everything else.
You don't have any of that capital expenditure, do you? You have You can try a load of different services with no real commitment, and then when you're ready to commit and you want a bigger discount, you can then jump into reserve instances, right, and reserve pricing to reduce your costs. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think as this conversation wasn't really phased, because obviously the title of this podcast means we've got absolutely massive bias, right? Because we work in the cloud every day. But I think the reason why we put this in as a topic is I think we just wanted to make it abundantly clear that the cloud isn't everything, right? It solves a lot of problems, for us IT professionals, but there is also absolutely legitimate use cases for still having on premise. And if you are an IT professional that has a lot of your infrastructure on premise, that doesn't automatically mean that you're doing the wrong thing, right? Just because there's newer technology out there. It's a journey, like you say, to the cloud, not just oh yeah, let's just drop all this and move to the cloud, right?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
just to quickly say, the other thing that's quite of a benefit to the cloud is that you can easily track a service, or say you've got a HR system that's up there, that's IaaS or PaaS. You can almost you've got the monthly cost of what that's costing you quite easily, that you can then recharge internally if that's what needs to happen to
Yeah.
budgets and things like that, where with you've already bought the server and everything, it's quite hard to engage how much the server actually costs,
Yeah, and
because
how
you've
you
got to build.
internally recharge that. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah. Yeah. And I think
So
that's it, because the pricing of the cloud is so transparent, right? Like I said before, the calculation is really simple, isn't it? Is that this you can even say, what is the total spend for this web app, right? And that could be, as your example is, as your HR app, and it's like, well, who's going to pay for that? That should probably come out of the HR budget, shouldn't it? That shouldn't be, and that whole how much did each department spend on IT is very easy to break down in the cloud, isn't it?
yeah, absolutely.
Cool. I think that pretty much wraps up. Is there any other bits that you wanted to add about that, Al? Any opinions you wanted to to voice or anything?
No, I think I've covered everything earlier.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Let's jump on some news so that we're not keeping all these people on this podcast for too long. So I've got three bits of news that I'm going to take us through. So Azure Redis, Alan, have you ever used it? Do you know what it is?
Nope, I've not
So
heard of it.
Redis is an in-memory data store. So if you imagine you have a database, yeah, and the idea of the database is you put data into it, it stores it on disk for you, and when you want it again, it can retrieve it back, and it's durable, right? So if you shut down a database server, or if it goes offline, and when you fire it back up, touch wood, hopefully, all your data should be there. Well, Redis keeps all of your data in memory, right? And it can be persistent in Redis, but it can also be just volatile in memory. And what that means is, because it's in memory, it doesn't have to touch any hard disks. It's just inside the RAM of the server, which means it's lightning fast. And developers use it for like caching data. So it's like, you know, I'm frequently accessing this bit of data from the database instead of going back to the database every time, because it's quite expensive, computationally to go to a data store. I'm going to put it in, Redis cache, and I can go there, and it'll be a lot faster, and the load on my database server will be a lot lower. Anyway, so Azure have a product for Redis called Azure Cache, and now they have a plugin for Visual Studio Code, which allows you to view the data inside the Azure Redis cache directly from Visual Studio Code. So that can be really good for debugging, where you would, so you get a lot more visibility. It's inside of Microsoft's native tooling. So yeah, really good. It's currently in preview, and you can connect up to any of your Azure Redis instances that you've got in Azure that you've got access to. So
That sounds good.
yeah, so that's pretty cool. So we were talking earlier about replication, blob storage. I know you've used blob storage in the past, Al, but blob storage, for anybody that doesn't know is where you can give Microsoft an object that could be, let's say that's a picture of your favorite puppy or cat, if that's the sort of person you are. Um, then you can give that to Microsoft and they will store it for you. Now, Azure Blob Storage is already very, very durable. As Al mentioned, even in its, and I'm using air quotes, you can't see that because we're on a podcast, in its least durable form, I think it's stored in 3 separate locations inside of one data center. Is that correct? I
Yeah.
can't remember what the SLA is, but I think it's triple replication. And what you can do is you can set your level of redundancy on your blob storage account. So you can say, actually, what I want is I want I want my blob stored in multiple locations in the same region, so but now they've got blob storage object replication, which allows you to replicate objects to any region around the world. So you could say, you could even locally as well, but you could say, I want a copy of these blobs in in Australia or Singapore or or wherever, as well as them being, so I'm going to add them in London, for instance, like UK South. I'm going to add them into UK South, but I want them replicated to a completely separate region. That has been in preview. We've had that for a while, and now it's generally available. So that's a really good, because some applications would do that manually. Like developers would say, okay, I'm going to run a job to to replicate these every night at midnight, let's say. But now they don't need to do that. It can be done automatically. So yeah, it's really good. And my last bit of news is automatic VM patching is in preview now. So this is a question for you, Alan. Did we not already have automatic VM guest patching before? I assume we didn't, because this is now in preview.
I think it was. I think
It
you
was
could
part of
manage.
Windows, right?
Yeah, so you could do it within the operating system, and you could detect. You could see where virtual machines were on their patching level.
Yeah. Okay. So this automatic VM guest patching is where Azure itself actually manages the patching of those devices. So I don't know how this is. I suppose this is a question for you and everyone. I don't know how that differs from. I suppose this means that you can set your patching configuration in Azure instead of it having to do that configuration on the machine itself.
Yeah, and just I mean, Sam's got it up on a screen. Um, but just looking at it, it means that you can, if you've got availability sets and things like that, you can specify that not two machines in a pool can be patched at the same time.
Got it.
So
Okay.
that's probably some of the benefit there, that it will
Yeah.
not take down your service.
Because I suppose if you leave patching up to those individual servers, they have no a knowledge of the other servers that are potentially in that pool, right? So they could all patch, if they're on patch Tuesday and they're all set to patch at 3 a.m., right? And and there was an issue with that patch, potentially your whole availability set could go down. I mean, that's pretty unlikely, but it's probably happened before, right? So
Yes,
yeah.
it's probably taken some of the features of System Center, Configuration Manager, Patch Management, where you can do like groups of machines and things like that. I mean, System Center's now changed to Endpoint Manager, Configuration Manager, but yeah, I think it's probably bringing some of that to the cloud.
Yeah, yeah. No, IaaS isn't really my thing. I try to stay clear of it as much as I can, but I thought it seems like a great addition. I didn't realize I suppose I didn't have the context there of availability sets. That makes a lot of sense to me, especially in that scenario. So yeah, that's awesome. Did you have any news items you wanted to go through, Al?
No, I've not got anything this week.
Okay, that's cool. So yeah, so thanks everybody for listening. I hope you've gained some sort of insight in between the difference of on-premise and in the cloud, and why you might use one or the other, or a hybrid approach inside of your organization. So yeah, so that's great. I don't know what let's find out, shall we? Shall we give a sneak preview of what is next?
I was
I
just trying to find that.
Were you? Let me open the. So me and Al sat down after the last podcast and worked on all of the next episodes right up until technically March next year. Hopefully we make it that far. So the next one should be on Ignite. Is that correct? Have I got my timings right for that?
Yeah, I think it's going to be just on it, isn't it?
I think it's
Might.
something like the day after or something. I think we're going to record.
I think we're literally on it. I think it's
Oh,
the first day, so we might have to maybe
delay
just
slightly. Yeah.
delay to
Okay.
the Tuesday after.
Yeah. Okay.
So
But
a
yeah,
little bit of a delay.
next one is going to be all about Ignite. Any new announcements from Microsoft? Obviously, if you want to have access to that, it's free to attend, isn't it, Al? Because it's a virtual event.
Yep. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
all free, and I think it's all open now as well for registration.
Oh, is it? Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll have to get. I don't think I've actually registered for it yet, but I will definitely get registered for that. And then we're going to talk about ARM templates. I'm not going to tell you all the ones we're going to go through, but we're going to have a sort of conversation about ARM templates because they can seem quite overwhelming, but I believe they are very powerful in Azure, right?
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
so I think it's definitely worth people understanding what they are and what they're used for.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks very much for your time, Alan. And thanks everybody that was listening.
Yeah, thanks for listening. See ya.
Cheers. Bye bye.